here's what I'm going to tell you and talk about today. I'm going to talk about the 1962 Kefauver Harris Amendments to the Food and Drug Act. And the reason I'm talking about them is they really changed the whole scope of how the pharmaceutical industry works. And I was in the industry during these changes, so I can talk about them. So one of the things I'm going to cover today is how these amendments indirectly made patents mandatory for FDA approval, created a big pharma cartel with questionable ethics. And if you don't know what those questionable ethics are, I invite you to go to John Abramson's talk. He was on the panel with me on Sunday. He's written about that. And I think there's been other speakers who have talked about that too. So I'm not going to explain what those questionable ethics are. I think you've been hearing a lot about them. But it did shift our medical paradigm from prevention to treatment, which I know a lot of you are very unhappy about, as I am, and shaved 5 to 10 years off all of our lives. I'll show you how I've calculated that. I have to start with talking about pharmaceuticals and their contribution before I can move on to talking about the lifestyle changes and nutrients and things of this nature, because you'll understand that part better if I start with the pharmaceuticals. So bear with me. Also, I'm going to talk about how to reverse the changes, because if we know how the problem was created, that gives us the power to change it. So that's why I'm going into some detail today. Please bear with me. So first of all, most drug companies were started by doctors that had a good idea about what to do. And I'm going to talk about the Upjohn company. That's the company I was with, and the one that was actually involved in fighting these amendments. So William Upjohn created what he called the friable pill. Back in the late 1800s, a lot of the drugs that were in little pills passed right through the digestive system without releasing their nutrients or their drugs, because they didn't know how to make pills that would release the contents at a good rate. So Upjohn solved that problem by having the friable pill. And I have a little graphic here to show you. And he also developed a system to uniformly manufacture these pills, because obviously you need to have the right amount, the same amount in every pill. And so that was his contribution. And of course, when I joined in about 1976, the company was a medium-sized company. But let me get back to the amendments. They were put into place because of a dangerous drug called thalidomide. Dangerous to some people, but not others. We're going to get into that a little bit too. So thalidomide was mostly in Europe. It was put on the market as a safer alternative to barbiturates. And as you know, a lot of people died from barbiturates during the 50s and 60s. And when women took the thalidomide, they found it helped their morning sickness, so they started taking it. But unfortunately, thalidomide was not safe for babies. So if they took it in the first trimester of their pregnancy, the babies were born with lost limbs, or they died in utero, or they died quickly after their birth. And that, of course, was very bad. Now and why did this happen? Well, in the 60s, even though there was some evidence that young babies, fetuses basically, were very sensitive to drugs that the mother took, it was not widely appreciated. So the drug company did not think about that before they started advertising it for morning sickness. And it was usually used in Europe because in the US, the FDA had stopped and refused to have it approved, not because of this situation with the babies, because they didn't know it then, but because it had another side effect, which was peripheral neuropathy, which basically means the nerves in your extremities, right? That something was wrong. So the FDA did have the power to stop drugs they felt were unsafe. I want to make that very clear to you. These amendments were not needed for that. Anyhow, because in Europe they were having all these problems eventually with the babies, Congress felt it should try to pass some law to make sure that the American people felt safe. So they went to these Kefauver amendments that had been languished in Congress for 3 years. And these had nothing to do with safety. They were designed to give people confidence in generic drugs, which at that point in time were not very popular because some generic drugs, some drugs in general, have to be, you have to be confident in the amount you were getting and how well it was absorbed. And if you weren't, the drug didn't work for you. In fact, in some diseases, you could die if that drug wasn't released properly. And we hadn't figured out how to make generic drugs equivalent to what we call branded drugs. So this was a problem, and Kefauver thought that the way to fix it was to demand that generic companies do these very elaborate comparisons of their drugs to the branded drug so that people would buy them with confidence. So they have little to do with safety. But Harris joined Kefauver in this effort, and the result was the 1962 Kefauver Harris Amendments. And they really were incredibly powerful for the FDA. The FDA then had almost unlimited power over pharmaceutical development. Prior to the passage of these amendments, companies only needed to show that the drug was safe for the intended use. But after these amendments were passed, the FDA could demand exactly which animal studies needed to be done before the drug could be tested in humans, exactly how the human studies needed to be done to show safety and effectiveness, what advertising and labeling was permissible. And they even got so deep into the manufacturing practices that, they required, for example, the person who was overseeing the manufacturing to have certain degrees, college degrees. And we didn't have it at Upjohn at the time. When these were implemented, we had really great people running our manufacturing, but they did not always have college degrees, and we had to move them to another job because of these requirements. And very detailed records were required. Of course, we always had records, but this was, in many cases, overkill, and it really made it hard, especially on the smaller manufacturers. And also, maybe this was the biggest change in terms of what happened after the amendments were passed. Somebody in the FDA had to actually sign their name on the letter of approval. So somebody had to put their neck in the noose, so to speak. And of course, all drugs have side effects, right? So when a side effect came to the attention of Congress, this person would be on the hot seat. And this wasn't true before the amendments. Before the amendments, the manufacturer would send their data to the FDA. The FDA would look it over, and if the FDA didn't have any objections in 6 months, the company could start selling the drug in the 7th month. So nobody was putting their neck in the noose before these amendments passed. So this really changed the way the FDA dealt with the pharmaceutical companies, because of course, if anything went wrong, the FDA would be called on the carpet to Congress. Now, the other thing you have to realize about these amendments, and you'll see it when I show you the data, it's really living law. It's not just fixed. It grows every year, and it continues to what I call metastasize. And I say that because, as you'll see, all of this has had very negative consequences, even though the intent, of course, was to make drugs safer and more effective. And unfortunately, that is not what happened. And that's the data I'm going to share with you today. So how is effectiveness shown in the time before the amendments? Well, before the amendments, what drug companies would do when they had the drug to a place where they really thought it was ready for human testing, they would give samples to physicians whose word they trusted and say, please give this to the patients that you think need this or could benefit from it, and tell us, does it work or not? And the physicians would do that. And of course, the companies didn't want to sell something that didn't work because their reputation was very important, much more important than it was today. People would buy a drug from a company because they trusted that company. Today, basically, we don't think like that because we have these FDA approvals that we trust so much. And that's a problem because reputation should count. but I won't go into any more of that at this time. Okay, so after the amendments, there were a lot of drugs in the market, right, that hadn't gone through any rigorous effectiveness testing. And so what happened was the FDA asked the National Science Foundation to look at all the available literature and how doctors prescribed and decide if a drug was effective and to put it into different categories. Now, basically, before the amendments, if doctors didn't like the drug, they just didn't prescribe it. So the marketplace pretty much had taken out ineffective drugs. And this was shown when the National Science Foundation really only found a few percentage. I think it was 7, some people say 10%, depending how the data looks to you, as ineffective. There were other categories like possibly effective and things of that nature, but there were very few drugs that weren't good for anything. So the National Science Foundation added their own category as ineffective as a fixed combination. And this was a very controversial category. A lot of doctors really liked the fact that in some cases, like in antibiotics, they could have 2 drugs in 1 pill. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but there's a downside to that too. But at that point in time, about 40% of the top 200 drugs were in these fixed combinations. Now, if you have 2 drugs in a pill, you're probably going to have more side effects, or at least you might expect you would. That's bad. But the good news is that if someone has to take 2 drugs instead of 1, they may miss a pill on one of them, or they don't like taking that many pills, so they weren't as compliant. In other words, patients did not take their drugs as they should when they had 2 pills to take instead of 1. And also, by having the combination, the drug was a lot less expensive. And back in these days, we did not have, and really, in many ways, did not need insurance for healthcare and drugs. And that's a whole nother topic that I won't be able to get into today. But of course, you can feel free to ask questions about it if you want. It's not part of this talk. So there were some advantages. And actually, one of the biggest advantages, especially for antibiotics, was the combination could save a patient's life more effectively, oftentimes, than giving a single antibiotic. And the reason that is back in those days, we did not have the ability to do rapid testing and find out exactly what bacteria was in the person and which antibiotics it might be resistant to. So if you had to wait and give the patient a drug and wait a week to see if it had an effect, by the time you went, oops, I gave them the wrong one, and then you give them the second one, that person might have been so weakened by the week that they waited that, they didn't make it. Also, giving the 2 antibiotics instead of 1 decreased the chance that the person would become resistant to antibiotics. And of course, today, that's a real problem. In fact, it was already a problem starting in those days. So hospitals were routinely giving 2 antibiotics to make sure that they did not have resistance developing in their hospital.